So many thanks, Urja, for putting together this event. It's a pleasure to be talking with Elise and Michael. The topic today is truth, expertise, and democracy, which are all issues that fall into this kind of area of philosophy, kind of burgeoning now area of philosophy called political epistemology, which is also the title of Elise and Michael's upcoming book. So I thought perhaps we could start by two of you maybe telling us a little bit about what political epistemology is, and perhaps also why you decided to write a book on the topic.
Great. Yeah, thanks so much, Jonathan. Just to add my thanks to Urja and the philosopher for organizing this, and yeah, especially to Jonathan for reading the book and yeah, being in conversation with us today. And also thanks to everyone who's tuned in. So yeah, we wrote this book, which is called Political Epistemology and Introduction. So I guess I should say something, as Jonathan said, introducing you to political epistemology. Broadly speaking, at least I sort of think of it as the study of epistemological issues in politics, though that's perhaps not very helpful. I also think of it as kind of how our understanding of epistemological issues themselves, for instance, our understanding of knowledge or truth or expertise, can themselves be shaped by political forces. And so there's sort of two sides, I think, to political epistemology. And in the book, Elise and I talk about this. So we mention, on the one hand, how the political is epistemological, which is to say there are kind of epistemological questions at the center of politics and our political lives. I'm sure many of you know that today public discourse is kind of saturated with epistemic notions such as fake news, post-truth, epistemic bubbles, alternative facts, these sorts of things. And so one side of, I guess, yeah, the territory of political epistemology is concerned with that sort of stuff, the way in which epistemological issues are central to politics and public political discourse. And then on the other side, we think of how the epistemic itself can be quite infused with political issues. So for instance, how our notions, our standards, our institutions of information can themselves be inherently political. So for instance, what counts as true or who qualifies as an expert has a kind of inherently social dimension. And these are themes that I assume will come up in conversation today. Yeah, I guess I can hand it over to Elise to see if she has any of the sort of main themes she wants to talk about.
No, sure. Yeah, I can briefly speak to why we wrote the book. So I think one thing that Michael mentioned in his response is that current discourse is saturated with terms that seem right for epistemological analysis, like fake news. There's been a lot of talk of post-truth. People are concerned about the role of ignorance and how it's affected electoral outcomes. We hear terms like epistemic bubbles, truth decay, alternative facts. And then we also think there's like partly a sociological explanation for the interest in political epistemology since the 2016 U.S. election and Brexit. I think more philosophers have been interested in bringing together these two areas of philosophy, politics and epistemology, or political philosophy and epistemology, but there hadn't really been a systematic introduction to it until recently. And we think there's just been a lot of courses that have popped up related to this theme, partly because it's been of so much practical and political interest. And yeah, just to elaborate on some of the themes and questions the book touches on for anyone curious about the contents. So it goes through questions like, what's the proper role of truth in politics? How can we organize political systems so that they produce the right sort of outcomes, and how important is that? Do ignorance and irrationality threaten democracy, perhaps precisely because they threaten our ability to get at correct answers, or for some other reason? We also talk about disagreement in the book, polarization, to what extent it's real and a problem, as well as, of course, the role of truth in of experts in politics, and whether we should try to re-envision democracy, like, for example, consider litocracy, like Alex Guerrero session spoke about, or whether we should go even in some ways even more radical and go for epistocracy. So those are some of that's basically just like an overview content-wise of the book for anyone interested.
Yeah, that's fantastic. I can certainly testify to the fact that the book does give this kind of beautiful overview of the field. And as you mentioned, kind of a lot of it seems to be motivated by contemporary events, right? So this concern that somehow our politics is becoming disconnected from truth in some way because of fake news or post-truth epistemic bubbles and such. I think it therefore might be quite surprising to many readers that one of the first chapters on truth, you immediately get into a number of philosophers who argue that we shouldn't be concerned with truth at all in politics, right? Which seems to go against all these concerns we hear in the public sphere about kind of truth politics. And even figures like John Rawls, who's perhaps the most influential political philosopher of the 20th century, is one of those people who says we shouldn't even be talking about truth. So perhaps you can say a little bit about that kind of skepticism over kind of truth talk in politics.
Sure, yeah, I'm happy to jump in here. So the first chapter is really just about this kind of fraught relationship between politics and truth, and the main figures in that chapter are, I guess, people like John Rawls, Hannah Arendt, as well as a bit of George Orwell. And what we look at are sort of two different kinds of doubts or attacks on the role of truth in politics. And we call these the philosophical and the political attack. And on the sort of philosophical side of things, one thing we do is we look at John Rawls, who is someone who sort of famously or infamously said that he kind of wanted to keep truth out of politics. I think that's a bit misleading the way he sometimes talks about it, but roughly speaking, the idea is Rawls thought that, we have these kind of various beliefs about comprehensive moral, political, religious doctrines. And he thought when it came to trying to justify laws and policy, we couldn't simply give preference to or give priority to certain people's reasonable beliefs over other people's reasonable beliefs. So some religious doctrines over others or anything like that. So one thing we look at in the first chapter is this kind of philosophical idea of bracketing assumptions of truth when it comes to any of these particular comprehensive moral, political, philosophical, religious doctrines, and whether or not it's even possible to do that in politics. So this is sort of one side of the way in which people have thought it's important to, I guess, keep truth out of politics. And then perhaps strangely or unexpectedly, we try and link what Rawls is doing with some things that Hannah Arendt says, because Arendt is also someone who I think is concerned about people assuming they know the truth in politics and how assumptions about having the truth and thinking you know more than your political opponents can kind of shut down political discussion, debate, disagreement. And instead, when we think we know what's true, we try to impose a way of life on other people. So Arendt was someone who thought that for certain kinds of truth, it was somewhat dangerous, I suppose, to go into politics thinking we know what's best. And instead, we should keep alive this kind of idea of disagreement, contestation. So yeah, one of the things we do in the book is basically look at some ways in which we might try to bracket assumptions about truth and give, I guess, philosophical justifications for that.
So I take it that this kind of question of allowing for some kind of talk of truth in politics is connected to, but somewhat distinguished between a kind of skepticism about this role of expertise in politics. Right? That one can think that we have certain truths, perhaps factual truths or something in politics, and yet nonetheless be skeptical about the idea that we have political experts still. So how can it be that you can kind of be okay with some sort of truth talk and yet still have this kind of skepticism about expertise?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. So we think that some types of skepticism about expertise could be grounded in a sort of skepticism about the truth, because if there is no truth, there is no experts. But we think there are a lot of other ways to understand this type of skepticism about expertise as well. So a few different distinctions here. One, you might think, well, I'm skeptical about the very existence of experts. And as we noted, one reason for that could be because you're skeptical about the existence of truths, but you might be skeptical about the existence of experts because you're just skeptical that anybody can really know the relevant truths. That's like one source of skepticism. We call it metaphysical in the book because it's skepticism about like the the possibility of expertise. The second type of skepticism is epistemological. So you might think that there are such thing as experts within, say, some domain, but we're just not equipped to identify them. It's maybe too difficult to identify them about some issue. Then the third type of skepticism is political. So you might think there are experts. We can identify them, again, within some domain, perhaps, but still, they're not all that relevant to making political decisions. So you might think even if experts exist and we can identify them, it's still really important for us as citizens to make our own decisions or to think for ourselves. So I think so that's like one tripartite distinction about different sort of things that the skepticism could be directed toward. Another important distinction is between normative expertise and technical expertise, just like very broadly speaking. So skepticism about normative expertise would be skepticism regarding, again, either the existence of experts about, say, moral or political issues, or skepticism about our ability to identify moral experts, or again, skepticism about their relevance. And we think normative expertise skepticism is like relatively widespread in different varieties among philosophers and political theorists. Like there's this sort of worry that, at least in politics, we shouldn't let other people's like value judgments affecting our own. On the other hand, there's technical expertise skepticism. So skepticism about whether people are better or worse equipped to know the relevant like technical or descriptive facts. And this is a bit less widespread, though it is endorsed by some people. I think perhaps most explicitly, most recently, Jeffrey Friedman, who thinks that, well, we should be skeptical that there really are people who are better equipped to, say, solve contemporary social economic problems, just because these problems are so complex. We often just don't know the causes of these problems. We don't know how to effectively solve them. So he's broadly worried about the sort of takeover of current political arrangements by like so-called technocrats. But yeah, so those are some of the different types of skepticism that people might have. And we don't take a stance in the book on like how exactly to interpret lay people's skepticism. Of course, there are philosophical discussions, but I'm not always sure where the skepticism from lay people is coming from, how to classify it exactly.
Actually, say a little bit more about this third class of the political skepticism, right? So we might think that, particularly in democratic politics, there is a kind of normative problem with allowing for experts and expert authority.
Yeah, so I think here one of the things that motivates us is this thought that, well, David Estlin has this great thing he calls the expert boss fallacy. And he basically says that, well, you might know better, but who made you the boss? And so this third type of skepticism we think is especially interesting because it doesn't really question the existence of truths that are relevant to politics, doesn't really even question the existence of experts. It doesn't even question our ability to identify who the experts are. Instead, it says that we're now in a domain where there's something especially, I guess, questionable about surrendering your moral or political judgment to other people. And we don't really make this connection in the book, but it's somewhat related to a rather large and active debate in epistemology and moral philosophy about the role of deference to other people in the moral domain. And so a lot of philosophers have been arguing basically that there's something fishy, as David Enoch puts it, fishy or suboptimal or kind of suspect about relying on other people, surrendering your moral judgment, deferring to them when it comes to matters of morality. And we think that morality and politics in some ways are very closely related here, insofar as we think it's part of a more general skepticism about normative expertise. So it's not necessarily skepticism about like the existence of such people, but rather it's just skepticism about whether or not politics and morality are domains where we shouldn't be exercising our own judgment. So I think that's maybe part of what's in the background here.
Maybe I'll just briefly add on to the discussion of the expert boss fallacy, because this is just something Michael and I have talked about offline. And I think it may have only been alluded to in the trust and expertise chapter. So on the one hand, there's something really plausible about the expert boss fallacy, like this idea that um, just because someone is in charge, that doesn't necessarily give them the authority to tell us what to do. On the other hand, there's something a little bit odd about political skepticism when you think through it a bit more. So if you really think that someone knows more than you on a particular issue, like you've identified the expert, you think they're a genuine expert, there seems to be something odd about saying but I'm not going to trust your judgment. Like there seems to be something almost acrotic to me about that sort of combination of views. On the other hand, it seems totally fine to think there are experts out there, but we're just not going to try to find out what they say because it's really valuable to think for ourselves. So I think thinking through the implications of political skepticism and when exactly it's tenable and what falls from it is really interesting, and yeah, worth getting clearer on.
So how deep do you think this tension runs between the kind of trusting or effort of experts, of deferring or surrendering one's judgment, as Michael put it, and thinking for yourself? I mean, one could say that to the extent to which I'm thinking about who the reliable experts are, what people I think are most likely to have the right knowledge, who do I think is sincere and reliable in expressing that, that's in a sense I'm exercising my own thinking, my own judgment in determining which experts to trust. I mean, is that sufficient, do you think, from a democratic perspective to kind of nullify this concern? Or do you think there's something deeper tension between these two things?
I guess I think it's probably motivated by the fact that you think that people who are alleged experts don't necessarily share your values. So I think what might be going on here is that there are people who are kind of publicly recognized as experts. They're credentialed specialists in a particular topic. They might have a lot more technical, empirical, factual knowledge than you do about certain issues. And it's not necessarily the case that people think we should be making up our own minds about kind of complicated, empirical, factual, scientific issues or anything like that. But I suspect that the worry is that there's this kind of entanglement between fact and value, which goes way back in literature on the philosophy of science. So I suspect that some people's skepticism about these experts in politics stems from this idea that there's a kind of value assumptions being made in the background at various places. And they don't necessarily have your interests in mind, or their own kind of social economic background is different from yours. And so you can't really trust that they're going to, I guess, use the factual expertise that they have in ways that necessarily reflect your own kind of values, interests.
Yeah, maybe just to build on that, and in response to Jonathan's question regarding sort of reconciling, our deference to experts and this sort of autonomy, thinking for yourself. Yeah, one idea I think you mentioned, Jonathan, which I don't think we talk about in the book much, is you might think, well, deferring to experts is consistent with preserving your own autonomous judgment because you get to choose the relevant experts. One tension that comes up a lot through the chapter on trust and expertise is this tension between, or as Liz Anderson puts it, between being sort of democratically informed versus being, or sorry, rather just being democratic versus being empirically responsible, and those two things often trade off of each other. And what's interesting is in Alexis de Tocqueville's 1831 book, Democracy in America, he previously pointed to this tension, perhaps inherent between democracy and expertise. So I have a quote here. He says that intellectual influence must necessarily be very limited in a country where the citizens, placed on an equal footing, are all closely seen by one another, with no one obviously or uncontroversially superior. So the idea is that when you think that all citizens are inherently equal, then you're going to also be less willing to rely on others' judgment, because you have to admit that someone else is superior in some way, in order to trust them as an expert. So there's this potentially inherent tension between expertise and democracy that comes up, in Tocqueville, but then also echoed by people like Liz Anderson, Cristiano, Kitcher, and so on. And then there's this question of how exactly to reconcile them. And so you might think, well, yeah, we can let people autonomously judge who the experts are, but is that going to actually be, how good are they going to be at that? So you might think there's a trade-off there for being empirically responsible. But then once you push away from allowing the people to judge, then that ends up seeming like it's going to be more like epistocratic and just relying and like sort of contravene the assumptions of democracy.
Great. So you have this kind of problem of, yes, we can exercise our judgment, but perhaps we're somehow limited in doing this, right? By the very nature of expertise, we're not going to know as much as the people who we're trying to judge. And then even if we do, perhaps there's an innate kind of lack of egalitarianism in the concept of expertise, right? That it just naturally creates a kind of hierarchy, which is in
Right,
tension
yeah.
with democracy.
Yeah, exactly. And maybe I'll just briefly mention one other sort of concern too, which Michael alluded to as well, is that one thing that's really important in a democracy is you're sort of like neutral about different like competing conceptions of the good, or at least in a liberal democracy. But given that experts, like all of us, just smuggle in their value judgments into their claims, then you might worry that certain value judgments are getting more say or more airtime when experts are making or informing political decisions. So I think there's a few different worries there. One is that the notion of expertise is inherently unequal. Another is that there's this threat to neutrality if we rely on experts too much.
So a possible solution here, which kind of none people in the literature go for, and you discuss in the book, is to kind of use partisanship as a way to align your own political values with those of potential experts. Right? So if you can kind of pick those experts who might otherwise share a certain, well, either preference for a political party or sort of a wider kind of political worldview, right? Perhaps you end up trusting Paul Krugman because he writes the New York Times, and the New York Times generally shares your values. So you kind of go with this kind of idea. And that way you can kind of get over the fact that, yes, they're struggling in a lot of normative judgments along the way, which you can't always tell. But as long as you can somehow align yourself with people who generally share those values, you don't need to necessarily worry too much. So I take it that both of you have some skepticism over this kind of solution. So perhaps you could say a little bit about why you're skeptical.
I can start unless Michael wants to.
No, go for it.
Okay, yeah, as you mentioned, both Michael and I have expressed skepticism about this idea in different contexts. So I think for both of us, it's not so much skepticism about the story per se. Like, I think that if people can correctly identify their values, can correctly identify the values of others, and can correctly identify how those values are informing the other person's judgment, then there might not necessarily be a problem with using like co-partisanship as a cue and figure out who to defer to, because I do like acknowledge and accept this idea that values affect our judgments, including experts' judgments, and so we want to basically know how to act in light of that. But I think we both worry that co-partisanship is not a very reliable cue for identifying values. And as Michael mentions in his one of his papers in reviewing Maxime Lepoutra's work, you might worry that if people were to use this as a cue and say dismissing like scientists' judgment about whether climate change is occurring, they'd have to know a lot of information in order to be rational in dismissing them. So they would need to know that the influence of the values on the scientists' judgments are like not are not trivial, that there's sort of substantial influence on, like, say, their liberal values on their scientific judgments about, say, whether climate change is occurring. They need to know that their values differ substantially from the listeners' from their own value judgments. They need to not be mistaken about what their normative commitments are and how they should influence, and so on. You also might think, well, their own normative concerns need not be have to not be deeply misguided as well. So we both think there are sort of significant concerns with implementing this idea in practice, although we both think, I think we both think that in theory, it's a perfectly fine model, but in practice it's just going to backfire. But Michael, did you want to elaborate? Because now I'm just summarizing some of your key
that's
points and
super
doing a
helpful.
bad job.
No, I mean, I think Elise and I, we both sort of written about this. We think that philosophers recently have tried to, I guess, defend the rationality of ordinary citizens, ordinary voters in various ways. So there are, papers being written about how forms of polarization are rational. There are papers being written about how this kind of, I guess, partisan epistemology, relying only on scientists who share your values, can be rational. And we think that those are all perfectly good rationalizing stories in the sense that it's compatible that there can be forms of polarization that are rational. It's compatible that people can defer to scientists on the basis of values in this way, and it sort of get things right. It be epistemically responsible. We just think it's highly unlikely that ordinary citizens typically meet the conditions to do this in the kind of epistemically responsible way. So Elise had mentioned a few things, but you need to know, for instance, whether or not certain kinds of values that you reject have gotten into the evaluation made by scientists whose testimony you don't trust. You need to know that those values are different from your own. You need to know that your values are ones that maybe aren't distorted in certain ways. And these are all things where I think there's just too many concerns coming from psychology about the rationality of ordinary citizens, especially those who are kind of emotionally invested in politics, to think that these kind of people who are rejecting scientific testimony are going to be the ones who have gone through this really sort of difficult process of figuring out, where the values differ and so on and so forth. So we try and be somewhat ecumenical and say these philosophers are right, that this is possible. We just think that it's probably not the best description of the facts on the ground, so to speak.
Maybe I'll just add one thing briefly to the discussion as well, because it's a recurring theme in the book. So I think both Michael and I are skeptical that partisanship really is a good proxy for values. So whether partisanship is such a proxy depends on how you think about partisanship. So broadly speaking, there are sort of two different theories. One is this sort of like folk theory, which claims that where the model is something like you and your fellow co-partisan, maybe some sort of partisan elite, both independently share the same values, and then you can easily sort of like plug in their judgments for your own in light of that information. So it's like a hyper rational model of how partisan identities get formed. By contrast, more work in psychology and like political psychology more specifically suggests that the correct model of partisanship is one on which partisanship is more of a social identity based more on like emotional and in-group ties. And if that's right, then partisanship isn't really a proxy for shared values, at least not like a sort of independent proxy. So it's almost like it's not like you independently share values and that's why you form the shared partisan identity. The worry is something like that gets the relationship backwards, like your values are somehow descended from like your in-group loyalties. And if that's right, it doesn't seem like as rational of a model to be using.
Okay, so party comes first before values on that second model, right? Rather than linking the values. So I'm wondering in this objection, right? So I take it you're kind of pressing that in a way these philosophical work is kind of over-intellectualizing the process by which people are connecting parties to trust to experts, right? They give you lots of nice, clean conditions, and if they match them, it would be great, but that's probably not what happens in practice. Do you think that this kind of the process by which the public might do it. So let's say they go along a kind of the way you think that they do. Is there a sense in which this might still be effective from a kind of instrumental point of view from democracy, even if it's not rational on the individual level, right? As long as people are joining up their group identities in these ways, it might be helping, these parties to track interests and expertise to align, even though if you judge the individual citizen, it might not look rational. There still could be a kind of effectiveness case for it.
I think that's definitely possible. So I don't want to rule out that possibility. I guess maybe what we're reacting to in the book, at least, is, and this is where a distinction between two different and important epistemological concepts matters, is between just getting at truth and being justified, or getting at truth and being rational. And from what we've read, it seems like a lot of people, at least in epistemology, have been trying to offer this as a story about the rationality of people who think this way. But of course, it could be irrational and still, sort of reliably and luckily, maybe even get at truth in certain cases, just because these more crude, less rational ways of, I guess, forming judgments with people who think similarly to you does, I guess, do a good job at securing what's in your own best interest in the long run. So you end up voting for politicians and parties which do have your interests in mind. So yeah, I wouldn't want to say that it's not possible. I guess more work needs to be done to say that it's not just irrational when people do this, but that it also ends up being somehow against their interests. I'm not sure if Elise has anything to add to
that. Yeah, so I definitely think it's right to separate out these two questions, like whether it's a rational process or whether it's a reliable process, and then further whether it's a sort of individually reliable process versus a collectively reliable process. We don't talk about that too much in the book. I'll just read one quote to maybe push back against thinking that it's a reliable process. So there's work by Lau and Breadloss, who have done a lot of work on political cues. And they say that heavy reliance on political heuristics actually makes decision-making less accurate among those low in political sophistication. So only relative experts appear to be generally helped in their decision-making after using heuristics. So basically the translation is like, if you're thinking that partisanship is like one of these cues that people can use to form their beliefs, that's going to be most useful to people who are not already well informed, but they're also more likely to be led astray by those cues as well. So they might end up deferring to partisans, partly because they think that their co-partisan or the person who represents their party is going to address the economic problems that they want, but because they are not very well informed, those policies actually backfire, and the policies that get implemented actually say make the economy worse. So I think there's potentially it's not obvious to me that these cues are still going to get people what's in their best interest, even on either an individual or a collective level. But yeah, also maybe just quickly to respond to your first comment, Jonathan, about us pushing back against these hyper rationalistic models. This is also maybe a running theme throughout the book, which is that a lot of philosophers have started to offer, I think, very well motivated and like charitable explanations to rationalize some phenomenon we see, like partisan deference or polarization. And both Michael and I think, like, yeah, in the abstract, those sound great. And if that's exactly how it worked on the ground, then we think that these would vindicate the rationality of certain phenomenon. We're just often a bit more skeptical that that's actually how things work on the ground. So yeah, this comes up in the polarization chapter as one further example.
Great. So I want to move for questions to the audience in just a moment, but I just wanted to invite you perhaps briefly to maybe say something about what you think could help with this relationship between citizens and experts, right? So partisanship might not help, but there's a number of different proposals in the literature, right? So Magdalena Guerrero, who was on one of these previous events, right, talked about having a database of experts that's kind of checked and monitored by experts. You have people who think we should include deliberative mini publics alongside forms of expertise to try and bring out the kind of normative assumptions that go into expert work. There's adversarial models. I mean, do any of these, do you think, are a bit more promising in helping to kind of improve the relationship between experts and democracy?
I mean, I'm kind of biased, but after the last event with Alex, I'm sold on latocracy. So I don't expect everyone here to know what that is, but roughly, the idea, at least as it pertains to this question about expertise, is we kind of need to have citizen representatives. So we get rid of politicians, we get rid of elections, political parties. And in doing so, one of the effects of that is it really drives down these incentives to be polarized, to get emotionally invested in politics, to see yourself as a member of a particular political team, and then other people as, who disagree with you as the enemy. And instead, what you do is you have this kind of large group of citizen assemblies, 450 people, I think, according to Alex, who themselves try and become experts on single sort of issues, agriculture, education, healthcare, so on and so forth. And what you then do is you supplement that with a kind of, as you mentioned, Jonathan, a sort of database of expertise, where you then also randomly select from this database such that there's no real chance of people trying to only select the particular experts who maybe share certain values, who can push the political winds in certain directions. I think this is a super fascinating and interesting proposal, but I know that latocracy is not probably going to happen tomorrow. Sorry, Alex, if you're here. I don't know if Elise has a different take.
Yeah, I don't have a positive view about how to fix the problem. I mean, maybe I will say, like, to some extent, I'm like sympathetic to what Liz Anderson says in response to this problem, which is that there's really no tension between expertise and democracy if we're able to identify who can be trusted. And there are different cues that we can use that get discussed in the literature. So, for example, we can look toward credentials, to sort of dialectical skills. How well do they do in argumentation, track record, consensus, etc. Each of these cues individually is not going to work. So for instance, people can exploit like credentials, and dialectical skills don't always track expertise. But I sometimes worry that in the objections of the literature, people object to like individual cues as like not being fully reliable on their own. But I would hope that a sort of combination of different positive indicators of expertise and the absence of negative indicators does get us like some of the way there. Especially if you complement it with some of the reforms that Michael mentioned, such as getting rid of incentives to be like insincere if you're an expert, and to try to engage in like de-biasing and decreasing polarization, so that certain value judgments or background assumptions are not necessarily interfering with this ability to identify experts.
Okay, great. So if it's okay with the two of you, I'll move to some questions from the audience. So the first is from Josh, who asks if your position on truth can be reconciled with the post-structuralists like Foucault, who think that truth is really a production of effective values rather than a kind of acquaintance with empirical nature. So yeah, what's your view on the kind of Foucauldian critique of the role of truth in politics?
So yeah, Foucault is one of those people who don't pop up as much as we sort of would like in the book. I mean, no, I don't think either Elise nor I are post-structuralists or postmodernists at heart. We don't really have that kind of philosophical framework when we think about truth in politics. I mean, we are very, I guess, open to the idea that lots of things which purport to be neutral facts are not in fact neutral. So I think that that's an important lesson from people like Foucault, and that often it's the case that credentialed experts themselves come to the table with certain sorts of values and maybe even biases that shape the way they interpret problems and the solutions that they propose. So I don't think that there's a kind of inherent tension, I suppose, between expertise and this kind of post-structuralist view. In fact, I think if something like, this kind of post-structuralist take on at least certain kinds of truth is correct, which I'm sure it is, it probably suggests that what we need to do more is something you suggested, Jonathan. We need to do more of drawing out these kind of implicit assumptions that often, I guess, purport to be neutral in political discussions. That's at least how I would assume you'd go about reconciling this kind of need for experts, whilst also assuming that there's really no such thing as just completely neutral facts.
I don't have much to add. I'll just say that I think one value of some of the more recent philosophical discussion is that because we can draw these distinctions between different types of like expertise, skepticism about expertise and different things that might be directed toward, I think that allows us to also potentially get clearer on Foucault's position. Like, is the worry about the sort of entanglement between facts and values, which Michael and I are both like sympathetic to, and I think is to some extent widely shared. Or is it sort of skepticism about our ability to identify experts, just given the ways in which ideology can affect our understanding of truth? I think so. I think some of the tools we offer allow us to get clear on what the source of skepticism is and whether it's tenable.
Okay, so Peter asks, the worry that most citizens have about democracy is less about possessing or not possessing the truth about the good life or the best political regime, or even about technical expertise, but rather about the fact that standards of truth-telling are slipping in politics, in the media, and in public life generally. What do you think causes this, and is there a remedy for it in your view?
Do you want me to start, Elise?
Yeah, you've written on post-truth, so I feel like you're especially well suited.
More about diagnosing rather than about solutions. So I'm not sure I have, sadly, as much to say about what we can do about it. But yeah, I mean, in terms of this concern about, I guess, slipping standards for telling the truth, I mean, there are some ways in which I try and resist the kind of post-truth narrative, I think, which is I don't actually think that citizens care less about truth. There's a lot of talk about, how it's the death of truth and things like that. I mean, Time magazine in 2017 had like this, their cover was, "Is truth dead?" And I don't think it so much has to do with anything like the notion of truth being dead, but I think that, Peter's question is getting definitely at something, which is Simon Blackburn talks about how we shouldn't be talking in terms of post-truth. We should instead be talking in terms of post-trust and post-shame. And I really like this distinction. So Blackburn basically says post-shame is a kind of environment in which politicians no longer feel ashamed for lying and bullshitting. And post-trust is a kind of natural epistemological reaction to this environment where it makes sense. It's rational for citizens to no longer trust politicians if they're no longer afraid of being caught out as liars, as deceivers, as bullshitters. And so I do suspect that there's definitely been some kind of slipping of standards on the side of politicians. I do think that we are in a political culture where there seem to be more kind of just bald-faced lies than there used to be. I don't know. I guess I'm not sure whether citizens similarly lack concern with, accurate judgments or being sincere. Most people think that their political views are true and they believe them sincerely and they hold them with great conviction. So it's interesting because I do think that there's a kind of weird asymmetry here where I do think, citizens very much care about the truth in politics, but it does definitely seem like politicians are less afraid of saying things that aren't true. I haven't said anything about the solutions yet, but I'll see if Elise wants to jump in now because I've probably been talking too long while I think about solutions.
Yeah, unfortunately, I feel like the book is not full of solutions, just problems. But yeah, as far as like why truth telling has slipped, at least I feel like I'm engaging in epistemic trespassing right now. I'm speaking beyond my small purview of expertise. But I imagine that one part of the cause is incentives on social media. Like basically, it's the media equivalent of sex sells. Like if you say things that are sort of over the top, hot takey, that's going to get more shares than if you just say something that's strictly speaking true. So if that's the cause, and again, I'm really speculating here. Um, then that suggests a solution as well, which is to potentially like change the social media incentives or engage in more social media review and such. But again, I'm not sure if that's exactly the cause. I'm really speculating. So no one call me out on saying something uninformed.
So Roran brings up the problem of expert disagreement. Right? So highlights that we've talked about the problem of trying to locate who the experts are. And he gives an example that they've listened to panel discussions. And often you find very large amounts of disagreement, even amongst people who we might generally consider to be experts, right? So you get, 5 experts in the room, perhaps you get 6 opinions. So do you talk about in the book about this problem of expert disagreement? So not just what do you do in locating the experts, but what do you do when the experts you've located end up disagreeing with one another?
Yeah, we do talk briefly about it, and I do agree that it is a real problem. It really threatens, in some cases, I think it can threaten everyday citizens' ability to identify experts. So just for more terminology and more distinctions, because I know that's what the people love. In the literature, there's like the novice expert problems. This is like how can we as novices or lay people identify experts in contrast to like pseudo experts or quacks. Then the other problem is the novice like two experts problem. So how do we assess the relative credibility of experts in cases where they disagree? And again, to some extent, you can try to use some of those cues I mentioned earlier, like, well, who has better credentials, who has a better reputation within the community, who has a better track record. Um, those again are going to not always going to, sorry, they're either in some cases not going to be usable by citizens, like it might be really hard to assess people's track records in some cases. In other cases, they might just not be reliable, right? Dialectical skills are can be a poor guide to expertise because academics aren't always very eloquent, and some quacks are quite eloquent. So those are some like cues that I don't necessarily think are always going to solve the problem. Another thing you can look toward is consensus. So if like 70% of experts like agree that about some conclusion, then maybe all else equal, you should defer to that if you're a layperson. But the further details really matter here. But in cases where it's say like 95% of experts agree, and the 5% can be explained away by maybe some incentives that they're following, then I think that's like that's a pretty good sign that you should defer. In other cases, think it's going to be a lot harder and more tricky, and then maybe we should just suspend judgment then.
Just to add to this, I mean, Jeffrey Friedman has this great book called Power Without Knowledge, and in that he has a whole chapter, at least, on technocratic expert disagreement. So he basically thinks that because of the sheer complexity of modern social problems, it's really difficult to have knowledge of, which problems are significant, what their causes are, which actions is most effectively solve them, et cetera. And he thinks that because there's always basically disagreement about these large modern social problems, for that reason, skepticism about expertise is always justified. I don't know if Elise or I want to say anything as strong as that, but it does certainly seem like we should all reduce our confidence in our political opinions if it's the case that the experts can't even agree. I suspect what ends up happening, though, is that rather than treating expert disagreement as a reason to downgrade your confidence, we instead treat it as a reason to just let other things make the decision for us, our own values, our partisan leanings, things like that. So we instead just pick experts based on, other kinds of non-epistemic priorities or preferences. But I definitely agree that, in the face of expert disagreement, it seems justified to be less confident in your own beliefs.
So Lucas asks if you discuss the relationship between populism and expertise in the book, and whether you have a view on the relationship between expertise and populism.
We do. I wish we had space for it to be longer. We kind of have maybe a page and a half, 2-page discussion in the chapter on expertise and trust, where we talk about some of what other scholars identify as the kind of main features of a sort of populist epistemology. And then we try and tie that to some of the discussion that we have about expertise. And in the kind of literature that we've been looking at, people who talk about this distinctive kind of populist epistemology often talk about how you find a kind of distrust of experts, or distrust of at least credentialed experts of a particular kind. And instead you find this kind of emphasis on the people, this championing of the people. There's this kind of antagonistic relationship between the people and elites, and credentialed experts are often seen as members of this kind of elite who can't be trusted. So this leads to a kind of skepticism, generally speaking, about expertise. And another aspect that comes up here is this kind of like anti-pluralistic attitude in the literature on populism and populist epistemology, where there's this kind of contrast between the technical and complex solutions proposed by credentialed experts versus the kind of ordinary wisdom, or the wisdom of ordinary citizens, rather, where it's seen as sort of simple, practical solutions and good common sense are all we need to figure out the difficult modern social problems. I'm not sure if that's like a perfectly fair characterization of this sort of populist epistemology, but people often talk about it this way. So the stark contrast is between credentialed experts who have very complex technical solutions versus the ordinary wisdom of citizens, where common sense can kind of tell us what to do. And so a background assumption here, I think, is that the political world and modern social moral problems are actually much simpler than people seem to think that they are. And their solutions are supposed to be self-evident. So we do have a brief discussion along those lines in the book.
There's a couple of questions about the forthcoming Trump presidency. So perhaps I can cluster those two together, and you might have some thoughts. So one is asking about whether we can still consider there to be any link between truth and democracy post the election. And another one more specifically asking about the Project 2025 proposals to, and I'm paraphrasing the person's question, but in a sense, de-expertise some of the bureaucratic agencies, right? To kind of take away bureaucratic long-term forms of expertise and replace that with political appointees, right, that are more conducive to what the Trump administration might be wanting to do. So they both ask you to kind of comment in some way on what the forthcoming Trump presidency might mean for these kinds of topics.
Yeah, it's a great question. Definitely a can of worms. I'll speak briefly to then invite Michael to. Yeah, so I think the question about whether the link between truth and democracy will be severed in January 2025 is a little bit complex, partly for the reason Michael mentioned in talking about post-truth, right? You might think, well, we still care about truth. One of the reasons where people might be worried about the Trump presidency is because it's not going to get the sort of right outcomes. By contrast, some people might have voted for him because they thought that it would generate or lead to the correct outcomes. Regarding the concern about Project 2025, I on the one hand, I do think that is a fair concern about the sort of political appointees that he is making insofar as they're being appointed because they'll serve the Trump agenda, and he'll remove anyone who wouldn't. On the other hand, DOGE, the Department of Government Efficiency, I take it that people like Elon Musk and Ramaswamy are supposed to be in charge of it because they are experts in efficiency. So I mean, I think there is definitely a real concern here. Whether the concern should be couched in terms of them substituting who would have been experts with just political appointees, whether that's like the right characterization is, I think, a sort of further question. And people like Jeffrey Friedman, as Michael mentioned, might be sort of cheer the lack of esteem for so-called technocrats because they really don't know what they're doing more than many other people. But Michael, do you wanna jump in and step in the can of worms in the last 30 seconds?
I'm very reluctant just because as a Canadian who's lived in England for a long time, obviously I watch American politics from afar, but I myself am very non-partisan on a lot of these issues. So I guess even the framing of the question, I'm a bit hesitant because it is a can of worms. I mean, I agree with you that there are real concerns about the relationship between truth and democracy if it's the case that political appointees are trying to put their thumb on the scale in a way that removes the diversity of opinion necessary for getting good epistemic results. So in general, it's good to have a kind of diversity of opinion if you're looking to get at the truth. And if it seems like what's going on here is a flouting of the importance of diverse opinion, then I definitely think that there will be very negative repercussions for truth. Maybe I'll just leave it at that.